This is the School Leadership Show, the only podcast dedicated to helping practicing and aspiring school leaders improve their craft. The School Leadership Show brings together thought leaders from inside and outside of education to deliver you the insights and tools you need to succeed in school leadership. Welcome to the 46th episode of the School Leadership Show. In this episode, I interview former Phi Delta Kappan Editor-in-Chief Joan Richardson. Joan is now in charge of the polling for PDK, and she has written an article on the 50-year history of the annual Kappan Poll of U.S. attitudes toward public schools. There's also a cool timeline compiling key findings from the last 5 decades of results, along with noteworthy events in the nation each year. The links to each of those are in the show notes. I had no idea about the origins of this annual poll, and I hope you find it as fascinating as I did. Joan has promised to come back on the show when the results of the current year's poll are released in September. Enjoy this conversation with Joan Richardson. I'm here with Joan Richardson. Hi, Joan.
Hi, how are you?
I'm fantastic. Thanks for joining me. Joan
Sure.
is the director of the PDK poll of the public's attitudes toward the public schools, which we'll get into in a second, and she's also the former editor-in-chief of Kappan Magazine, which, by the way, I have been a happy subscriber to since I started my teaching career in 1996.
Well, that's excellent. That's good to hear.
So tell folks a little bit about your background before we get into the poll.
Okay, sure. Well, my background's very different from probably any of the people listening to this because I came to this job after a career in the newspaper business. So I've had 2 pretty distinct careers, and my first career was as a newspaper reporter and editor. The last newspaper I worked at was the Detroit Free Press, and I left that, sadly, because of a strike there in the mid-1990s. But I found a new life working for nonprofit organizations in education. And my last job at the Free Press had been as an education reporter. So I was quite interested in K-12 education issues and left that career to become Director of Communications for what was then the National Staff Development Council. And I stayed there until I had the opportunity to join PDK as editor of Kappan 10 years ago. So it's been very interesting, and I have worked with the poll ever since I arrived at PDK, but became much more involved in it, much more responsible for it when there was a change of executive directors at PDK. And when Josh Starr came in as the new executive director CEO in 2015, that's when I really became responsible for the day-to-day management of the poll. And I left my position as editor of Kappan at the end of last year and now concentrate exclusively on the PDK poll.
Wow, very cool. And so a little bit about the history. So this was the 50th year of the poll, and you wrote a piece that appears on the Kappan website about the history of the poll. You want to talk a little bit about its history? It was fascinating.
Yeah, the history is, I kind of went down the rabbit hole on the history of the poll because I was so intrigued by what I was learning about it. The poll started because of, there were two young men, 2 37-year-old guys, Chuck Kettering and Ed Brainerd, who were working together at a foundation in Denver. And it was a foundation that Chuck Kettering started with family money that he had, and he was very interested in education, so he took his family money and he was able to devote his time and his energy and his resources to doing more in education. And Ed Brainerd was a traditional educator. He had been a principal, he has his doctorate in education, and he went to work for Chuck at Chuck's foundation. And they were kind of sitting around one day talking the way we all kind of talk at work and noodling around different ideas and thinking about the kind of things that they'd like to do, what they were curious about. And they decided that they were really curious about public opinion about education, and nobody was doing any polling about what Americans thought about their schools. And because Chuck Kettering was who he was part of the Kettering family, which is a pretty prominent manufacturing family in the Midwest. He was on his grandfather's foundation board. And because he was on that foundation board, he knew George Gallup, who was also on that foundation board. And so he picked up the phone, he called George Gallup, and tried this idea out on him. And George Gallup thought it was a great idea and said to these two guys, why don't you come out here and let's talk about it. So they went out to his office in Princeton, New Jersey, and the three of them sat down and they sketched out a plan for the first poll. And they wrote, my memory is it's like 66 questions in the first poll. And they had an idea that it would go on. So even as they were writing the first questions, they had in their heads that they would do this again and again. And so they very deliberately wrote questions that they could use as kind of a baseline. And the poll got published. They printed like 100 to 150 copies of the poll. There was no internet, of course. And they just sent it around to people who they thought might be interested.
Well, they sold it. I think if I remember correctly, they sold them for $3 a copy.
Right. Yeah, it was not a big money-making venture at all.
Well,
and Stan Elam got a copy of it, and he wrote a very short item about it that appeared in Kappan magazine. Chuck and Ed were disappointed that they didn't get more coverage in the beginning, and Ed was a member of PDK. So when he saw the magazine, he called up Stan Elam, a lot of phone calling going on back in those days, and said, we're going to do this again. If we give you exclusive rights to it, will you run the whole thing in Kappan? And Stan Elam was he was a brilliant, probably the best Kappan editor there ever has been. And Stan said, yeah, we'll do that. And so that's how it got connected to PDK and how it ended up then in its second year being fully published in Kappan magazine.
Well, and you write about how when they were coming up with those initial questions, it was phone calls and snail mail. I was thinking about that. I thought, holy cow, that had to be excruciating in terms of getting that done. But I think you said it took like 6 weeks for them to come up with the final questions.
Right. Yeah, they were. I've had the opportunity to talk to Ed Brainerd a number of times in the last several months. He's just a delightful guy. 86, 87 years old, still lives in suburban Denver. And he says, they didn't think anything of it at the time. That's just how you did things in 1969. But, of course, today the process goes a lot faster. Well, it takes about as long, but there's a lot more back and forth, and it's done much more easily than it was back then.
Yeah. So if as you think about you had some time to look over, and the website does a great job of having all the polls on there. It's pretty cool how they're there, and you can click on them and learn about it. I went back and looked at the one from the year I graduated from high school. I mean, it was just super interesting. And
right.
When you think about it over time, what have been some of the biggest changes, and what have been some of the more constant themes that have run throughout?
Yeah, it is fascinating to go back and read through. I've read through all 50 years of the poll. And one thing that surprised me was although I graduated from high school in 1970, so I have a pretty good fix on what was going on in the early years of that poll, what the big issues were at that time. But it's very interesting to see how much concern there was about morality issues, how often we were asking questions about whether we should be teaching morality and ethics in schools, which very much surprised me. I was very surprised to see in the early 90s there was a question about condom distribution in schools, because that was very reflective of what was a huge concern at that time about AIDS and the expansion of AIDS. I've been surprised by, I was very surprised by how much support there was for national testing and for testing of a graduation test to ensure that kids would pass a test before they would graduate from high school, and how much interest there was in consistent curriculum across the country. Because, of course, in this era, we've seen so much kind of backlash against those very ideas. And it's a reminder that, it made me realize that in some ways policymakers do pay attention to what the American public is saying, and then things change. So those were really interesting to me. There has been a lot of questions over the years about discipline, of course, lots of questions about discipline and behavior. There's been a consistent theme about lack of funding for the public schools for the last 20 years.
Interesting. Did you feel like that just kind of bubbled up in the last 20 years, or?
It was there when we asked about the biggest problem, and the biggest problem is one of the things we've asked about every year since 1969. Funding comes up. Funding is relatively high most years, but for the last 19 years, it's been the number one issue that has been suggested by Americans. We don't, that's an open-ended question. So we just say, what do you think is the biggest problem? There's no effort to suggest to them what it might be. So that's a volunteered response. And clearly we haven't come up with a solution to that problem yet.
Well, at least not in the last 19 years.
Yeah.
So what, other than, sort of consistencies and changes over time, is there anything in looking through there that surprised you, or what surprised you the most in your research?
What really jumps out is when we come into the Common Core era, and we come into the era of kind of responses to nation at risk. You can see through the questions, you see the kind of I don't know the right word to use for it. Obsession may be the wrong word, but the poll shifts pretty substantially after that period of time, where there's almost no other questions that consume as much attention. They become the focal point of the poll. And it's very different from the years before that, where there was much more, I guess what I would call more widespread interest, lots of different topics that would be explored. And then suddenly all we're talking about are questions related to the Common Core and to testing and all of that. And it's quite a striking difference. And I think we're sort of coming out of that now, where we are, this year's poll, of course, which I can't tell you the questions that we asked or what the results are yet, but it's much more like some of those earlier polls. It's much more broad-based. You get a much broader feel of all the issues that concern education.
And is there, as you think about, and it's got to be cool to be involved in it year to year, so you can, kind of work the questions and based on data over the last few years, change things. Were there any questions in this most recent one, and maybe you can't answer this, but that you really you were pulling for? Like you really wanted to get certain kind of questions in, but they didn't make it for space or for whatever reason?
Yeah, we always have questions like that, the way the poll operates, we pay so much for so much time. And so we figure that we're paying for about 10 to 12 minutes of time per person. And we go through, a process of timing that out. So, for example, an open-ended question takes more time to elicit a response than a yes or no question. And so this year we had very few open-ended questions. We asked a total of 44 questions, which is a huge number of questions. In many years, we ask more like 30 to 35 questions. So a lot of it depends on the kind of question that you're asking, and when you time it out, yeah, there are always some really difficult decisions that have to be made about what gets left on the cutting room floor. But that's part of the challenge of editing anything.
Right. It's always harder to cut it down.
Yeah.
So, as you think about the results and the different audiences, so I know it was initially about, when Chuck and Ed, like I know them, when Chuck and Ed originally proposed it, they were really looking at how could they collect information that would be useful to superintendents, principals, and teachers, right?
Exactly.
And then over time, I think it's evolved into many, many different audiences. So as you think about the different audiences, how do you hope that those different groups of people use the results?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think there was a time when it became, partly because there was more federal influence on education, the poll asked more questions that had more of that federal feel to it, and there was and every executive director, every director of the poll has a different sense of what direction they want the poll to go in. And so there was a period of time when the poll really was designed, I think, with an idea that it would be read very closely by people in Washington. I think that has changed a lot now. Josh Starr, who has deep practitioner roots, he was a superintendent until 2015 when, shortly after he left the superintendency, he became CEO at PDK. And he has a deep feel for what superintendents and other school leaders want to know and how they could use the poll. And so in the last several years, I see it shifting back. I feel like there's a much greater sense that the questions that we ask, the answers to those questions, will be useful to people who are in school districts and people who are working at the state level. And I'll tell you this, when we work on the poll every year, we start off by pulling together an advisory group, which is in Washington because that's where we are. And so that group is always kind of inside the Beltway people. And so it has a certain flavor, that conversation does. Well, in 2017, we had a very generous grant from Carnegie Corporation of New York to do 2 state polls. And that gave us the opportunity to do 2 advisory committees, one in New York and one in Georgia. And it was so interesting to be at those planning meetings because the people in those state capitals, they think very differently about what the issues are that matter in education than do the people in Washington. So that was really a reminder to us that we need to keep our roots close to those practitioners. We need to be very mindful of what issues it is that matter most to them so that how we can be most helpful to them in the questions that we ask.
So how do you plan to do that moving forward? How do you keep that on the ground perspective?
Yeah. Well, I hope we would really love to do more state polls. That work was so interesting last year. Those results were so interesting and proved to be so valuable to, especially in Georgia, which had never had anything like that before. And I think the challenge for us is always just to keep our ear to the ground. We have a wide membership base. We are always open to hearing from people. As I'm sitting here talking to you, I just got an email from a member who wants to talk to me about the poll. So, we're never that far away from what our members want. And Josh, of course, is still doing a lot of work with school districts. So he is very much in touch with what's going on the ground and has a very finely tuned ear, I think, to what is of most interest to superintendents especially.
So as you think about the poll moving forward into the next 50 years, I guess. Do you have any predictions on how things might ebb and flow? We sort of saw that cycle of, you know, the peak of really focusing on accountability and testing and standards and that
Mm-hmm.
stuff, and that's ebbing a little bit. What do you see coming?
Boy, that's a really tough question. I mean, technology, of course, changes the way the poll is done, and so it's hard to know how that will influence just technically how we produce the poll in the future. You know, it's much easier now to turn the results around more quickly than it was certainly in 1969, and we have a pretty long time frame between, you know, we do the poll in May and we report the results in August. And so one of the things that I wonder about is how we shorten that time frame. And you may already have noticed this year that we had 8 questions in this year's poll that were about school security. And when we got those results back in June, we thought the results were so important that we did not want to wait to release them in August. So we peeled those off and we did a special release of just the responses to those 8 questions. Was it 2 weeks ago?
I saw that.
Yeah, and that was, I don't know if we'll do more of that sort of thing in the future, but we certainly saw that there was a lot of value in doing that. So, you know, that could be one of the things that changes. As I said, we would love to do more state polls. We think there's a lot of potential there to provide a deep look at what communities, you know, within a state are interested in, because so much more policy is going on in the state level now, certainly than there was for a period of time, and we think the poll could be a very useful tool to, you know, bring that voice to bear. We have no agenda, you know. We don't, you know, we let the chips fall where it may, and so we bring a pretty credible voice to those conversations, and would like to see if we can explore that option more going forward.
So if people want to learn more about the poll, see the results, where's the best place for them to do that?
Well, the best place is on the website. If you're a member of PDK, which of course we always encourage, you'll get a print copy of the poll results in the September issue of the magazine. But the poll website, which is pdkpoll.org, will be updated with the results this year on August 27th. And it will be the same as the content that's in the supplement to the magazine. All the charts, the top line, the questionnaire, everything will be available there. And then there's always the ongoing resource of the archive, which we maintain for members only at PDK. And you're getting a snippet of that on the 50-year timeline right now, but there's a whole lot more behind the paywall for people who are members of PDK, and you can see all the reports, all the questions, all the answers going back 50 years, and it's pretty fascinating stuff.
That is super cool. And I won't make you commit during the interview to a follow-up interview after the results come out, but I would love to have that conversation with you to just sort of unpack what we found this year and get a sense of that.
We would be happy to do that.
Well, Joan, I want to thank you so much for taking time to talk with me about this. It's absolutely fascinating, the history of it. And then, like I said, I'd love to dig into some of those individual questions that have gone over the course of 50 years and the trends that you've seen and things like that.
Yeah, we'd love to do that. And, of course, we welcome hearing from people anytime. There's many ways to comment on the website, both on the timeline pieces and when the results are out this year. And we look at all of it, and we would love to hear more from people about how they use it and how they think we could do more with it.
Okay, Joan Richardson,
right.
Former editor-in-chief of Kappan and current director of the poll. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mike. What a pleasure to talk to you. I enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the School Leadership Show, a podcast for aspiring and practicing school leaders. Send your comments, questions, and show ideas to me, Mike, at schoolleadershipshow.com. And please consider rating the podcast in iTunes and leaving a comment. And definitely pass the show along to your colleagues.